Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo Chapter 8 details are here, but y'all know the drill by now. We are dealing with rough translations, so be sure to come back on Sunday when we will do our official review. But with that being said, strap in. All right, Chapter 8 is seemingly titled The Three Heavenly Cursed Gods, and we begin on a panel of pitch black space with what appears to be just an asteroid floating through it. And we get some narration that says, "When gods clashed, the heavens trembled and the seas roared. Those who survived the ancient cataclysm would pass down forbidden rites and words of the gods. Even now, they sleep beneath the sacred stones." And then the editor's note says, "The story of the gods' demise begins anew." We then transition to what looks like a tent village, just tons of tents set up in this very rocky landscape. And it says, "A prayer for salvation echoes through the wasteland. May the curse be lifted." It's clear at this point that we are on an alien world because we cut to see two aliens walking amongst this rocky area. We have one adult and one older, like grandpa. And I've chosen Goku and Roshi here because the adult Samorian looks a lot like Super Saiyan 3 Goku. He's got like big flowing hair like that. And he's also got the three eyes like Maru and Cross and their little face markings. And the old man has that too. So, and I'm going to call them Goku and Roshi until we get actual names for them. So Goku says, "If you catch them, just feed them something and send them back." And Roshi says, "Well, that's easy for you to say, but with how things are now, the kids are starving. It wouldn't be strange for some of them to turn to stealing or other crimes just to survive." And Goku says, "Still, in the camp, there are jobs even children can do. So if they return and show a bit of skill, the adults will teach them a trade." And Roshi says, "You're more lenient than I thought." Huh. Better than wasting lives for nothing. And then we see the two of them come across a young Maru and Cross. And Goku says, "Okay, I got this." And yeah, we've got a trend going on here, okay? I've chosen Goten and Trunks to represent this young version of Maru and Cross because the clothes they're wearing look a lot like the DBZ fighters' gi. So Goku and Roshi walk up to these kids who are like in a prison, and Goku says, "Hey, wait, there's two of them in here." And Roshi says, yeah, they're twins. Figures." And then, without missing a beat, Maru and Cross just try to jump Goku. Like, they spring at him and throw some fists, and Goku is just nonchalantly, like, blocking each one of them. He then just backhands them once and sends them flying into a nearby wall, just completely taking them out. And he goes, "You've got spirit. That's good. Once you've cooled off, come help me with some work. If you do well, I might even feed you." And then he says, "We're building a canal." He then cut to them in this big quarry, and Goku is holding a pickaxe, and he's leading them, and he says, "For now, I'm just going to keep digging. You two gather the stones from this side and stack them neatly over on that side." He then points to like a little grouping of some other stones that are like kind of barricaded off, and he says, "Don't touch the stones on that side. Got it?" And they say, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Perfect. Just like that." Maru and Cross then get straight to it, and Roshi walks over to Goku and says, "Those brats really were some troublemakers, but it looks like knocking some sense into them was the right call." And Goku says, "Give it a few more rounds of hard labor and they'll straighten out just fine." We then cut to Maru and Cross like laying on the ground with huge wallops on their head as if they'd just both been like hit across the head. And Goku is saying, "You guys never learn, or are you just bored?" And this panel is next to the rocks from earlier that he told them not to touch. So I'm not sure if this is like a rough translation thing and I'm missing some context, or if we're just supposed to assume that they touched the rocks they weren't supposed to, and so he punished them for it. I'm not sure, but it's kind of played off as a comedic scene because both of them just have these huge lumps on their head, and Goku's got that, like, you know, typical anime manga sweat bead on the back of his head being like, "What are you guys doing?" So there's that. And then we cut to, again, the three of them with Goku standing in front of an enormous boulder, and Maru and Cross are just looking at him like, "What are you going to do about that?" And then he just suddenly punches it and shatters this thing into a million pieces, and the two of them are just awestruck by this show of power. He turns around and sees them just like gazing at him in admiration, and he goes, "What? And then we cut again to the three of them kind of like having a lunch break. And they call him Dura. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and I don't know if that's the right translation, but apparently Goku's name is Dura. And they say, "Why would you make a canal or whatever it is we're doing?" And Dura says, "Don't tell me you don't know." We then cut to an image of a world map as Dura starts to explain. Now, obviously, it's not a map of the Earth like I'm showing here, but this illustrates the same point. So Dura says, when carrying things to Shama, they take a sea route like this. And he kind of points to this dotted line that goes all the way around a continent. And Maru says, "Wow, that's a huge detour." And Dura says, "Yeah, that's why they're putting a canal here." And he basically shows that there is a much shorter route that cuts through the continent itself. And Maru goes, "Oh, I see." But Cross says, "But wait, why there?" And Maru looks at him and goes, "Cross." Okay, just a heads up before we continue. This next section includes a bunch of new names, like the names of peoples, tribes perhaps, but also like countries, the names of places. And again, since these are rough translations, I don't even know if these are accurate necessarily, but you're just going to hear me say a bunch of new words. So it might be a little confusing. So anyway, this continues with Cross like standing up and getting upset, and he's like starting to yell, and he says, "Why must we, the Loomer, do something that would draw attention in Deskunte?" And Dura says, "The plan to build a canal here has existed since long ago. But the Garyan and Karyan." And Cross looks at him and says, "Karyan?" And then we see Dura seemingly launch into like kind of a story. And we get this panel of this beast that kind of looks like a dog and a horse a little bit mixed together. We don't really get like a great shot of it. It's kind of dark and silhouetted. And he says, "There was a sacred creature for our people called the Karyan. And there was this incident that was a trigger. We were driven out of our village and our parents were killed. Because you see, other people, aside from the Loomer, insisted that the Karyan must be exterminated. Because the Karyan attacks and eats anyone who isn't from our Loomer tribe. The entire area is the Karyan's habitat during the planning of the canal. Deskunte's workers were attacked and the construction project was halted. It's not that we have to do it, it's that only we can do it." Cross says, "That doesn't answer my question. Who drove us into this land, to this parched land where no proper crops grow? Why should we work for Deskunte?" And Dura says, "It's not for Deskunte, this is for the Loomer. In this country where strength easily translates into power, you might not get it." Dura continues and says, "Even if we're attacked, if we just keep striking back, then nothing will ever change. If the Loomer don't change, then the Deskunte won't either. For people of different lands and bloodlines to coexist, they must share something in common, something that connects them through both time and space." And Cross just says, "Coexistence?" And Dura says, "Yes, when people live side by side, having something that passes between them makes it easier to accept each other's differences. A canal would be just that, a shared link between the Loomer and Deskunte peoples." We then get another image of a world map, not the same one from before, but Dura basically explains that once we finish this canal, we'll be able to draw water from the river down to Kiyamar village. And that water will flow through the settlements and into the farmlands. So even if the land is dry now, if we can keep clean water flowing constantly, diseases amongst the children will drop drastically. And Cross just kind of hangs his head and says, "I don't understand." We then cut to sometime in the future, maybe a couple of days later, and we see Maru and Dura are walking together, and Maru says, "Cross, he isn't coming today either." And Dura just kind of yawns and says, "Yeah, I guess he's still sulking. Cross's way of thinking isn't necessarily wrong. Actually, it's what most people believe. And since everyone thinks that way, I just went ahead and worked alone." And then we see the two of them kind of walking towards the quarry site, and all of a sudden Maru goes, "Oh my gosh!" And we see that there is just all of this chaos and destruction. Basically, all the work they had done has been undone, as like all of these rocks are like kind of back in the pathway of the canal that they dug. And Maru says, the section we dug out yesterday, the whole embankment collapsed." Seeing this, Maru immediately jumps to his brother's defense and says, "Cross would never do something like this." And we see that Cross is actually watching them. He's like standing up on a nearby ridge, looking down at them. And he does seem to be surprised by this destruction as well. So he seemingly didn't do it. And Dura then says, yeah, Cross wouldn't have done this, but there are others who would have taken advantage of this situation. We'll have to deal with them before we can get back to work. Most likely the scum who slipped into camp. And Maru says, so the culprit is, and Dura just says, no time to rest, huh? We then cut back to the tent village where we see a few characters kind of posted up smoking, and they're having a conversation, and one says, it's disgusting to act all sycophantic toward Diskunte. And another guy says, yeah, I heard Dura is taking money from them. And the first guy says, well, this should teach him a lesson. And then the leader kind of guy says, nah, Dura's a fool. He'll just keep digging that canal. And the other guy says, so what are we going to do then? And the leader says, we'll just have to keep fixing things. It's better than creating more problems, and Dura's too stupid to realize that. We then see Cross walk in this tent with these guys, and he says, yeah, Dura is. And they're like, who is this kid? And he just says, it would be faster to teach him physically. And one of the guys go, oh, it's one of the twins. But before he can even finish that thought, Cross's fist enters the panel and is like inches away from his face. He then just cut to later where we see Maru and Dura approaching the quarry to come work, and Cross is already there and he's already working. And Maru's like, Cross, you came back. And Cross is like, don't get this twisted. I just don't want to be lumped together with the rest of them. And we see that the three of them just get to working. And then we have a little bit of a montage where we see Maru and Cross with the cage where they're keeping all of the rocks. And they're like, hey, the cage broke. And Dura says, ask the old man about weaving. He's better at it than I am. We then cut to another scene of Dura and the boys planting some trees. And Maru's like, why are you planting stuff here? And Dura says, these guys are tough. They can endure the harsh conditions. Eventually, their roots will spread and take the place of the wooden supports when our cage wears out. And then we cut again to see that like this structure of wood, maybe like a bridge or something, broke, and this water is rushing past, and it has basically swept Maru up, and he's getting swept away. And Cross is like, hey, Maru's getting swept away. So after this montage, we see that they've completed some pretty good work on this canal. So we jump to a scene of this guy showing up to the quarry, who, if you recall, is Jabaroma, the guy that was from the first couple of chapters of Modulo. And he shows up and says, the village elders have approved of the plan. We will officially begin work on the canal project. And we'll use this canal to irrigate the Lumer River area, and this will greatly benefit the surrounding villages. You see that there are a ton of people gathered for this good news, and Maru is looking around. He's like, wow, so many people came. He then see Dura swing his arm around Jabarama, and he is loving it right now. And he goes, I knew you would pull this off. I guess I fooled you into thinking we could actually do this, huh? And Jabaroma's like, you always manage to make things go smoothly, don't you? And he goes, but still, you leading the work ahead of schedule, I can't deny that your efforts were the real reasons the elders decided to move forward. We then see that amongst all of the people gathered here are the guys that sabotaged the quarry earlier, the ones that Cross threw hands with. And Cross notices them, and he thinks back to what Dura told him about people have to coexist and come to a mutual understanding. So Cross walks up to them, and they're like, hey, what do you want? And Cross just bows before them graciously, and he says, I was in the wrong for striking you. Thank you for helping out. And the guys just kind of laugh, and they say, well, I guess that makes us even then. We then see Maru and Dura like come walking over to this, and Cross just turns to look at Dura and says, I understand. And Maru's like confused, and Dura is just smiling and laughing. We then just have another long montage of people continuing to work on this canal until we jump a few years in the future. So we see that Maru and Cross are now like young teenagers, and we see that the canal has been completed, and the two of them, along with Dura and others, are standing on the shore of this watching a huge ship pass through it. We then cut to Dura, Jabaloma, Maru, and Cross, and some others back in one of the tents. And Dura says, we've received a request from Diskunte. They want to build port facilities along the canal so that ships can dock in the middle of the route. And he's like, if the port thrives, it'll strengthen the flow of trade between Lumer and Diskunte. And as this is being talked about, Cross is just looking at Jabaloma, who just seems to be kind of like cold. Jabba says, so in other words, and Dura says, yes, it means reopening trade between Lumer and Diskunte. And then we cut to Cross's kind of internal monologue, who's still just looking at Jabba, and he's like, you know, it's at that time that I'm sure he had just buried the pain of wanting to die, because I've never seen him angry or spreading resentment. But we were all wounded by Deskunte's isolationist policies. Jabba lost his daughter because of them. I respect him. We then see them talk about different potential locations for these ports, and then things just devolve into celebration. Everyone is excited and happy that, they've finished this canal and their alliance is doing well. Trade is about to reopen, so people start drinking. Maru is having the time of his life. Cross is being kind of the awkward one in the middle of this, not knowing what to do. And then his narration continues and says, if we've already hit rock bottom, then the only way to go from here is up. And I said, yeah, I thought from here everything would start turning around for the better. But that was the day when the Karyan devoured the daughter of the Deskunte's chieftain. And that's where the chapter ends, with an editor's note that says, a shocking tragedy strikes the revival of the Canal project. And for anyone who doesn't remember, the Karyan is that beast that we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, the one that attacks anyone who's not of the Lumiere tribe, right? So one of these things killed and ate the daughter of the Deskunte chieftain. So obviously this is going to throw a wrench into their budding alliance and, restructuring. So this is probably the tragedy that causes the downfall of the entire planet, I would imagine. Maybe not, but probably, right? And this chapter was just so interesting. It shed so much light on the Samurians and what's going on with them, right? I think it's probably clear to say now that the man-made disaster was one of their own doing. It was of their own humanity and not something that Earthlings caused. But yeah, I loved this chapter for Cross's development because it explains him so much, right? Because we know even on his original planet, he had all of these doubts about other people, right? Like not trusting humanity. And I know we're using humanity loosely here because I'm talking about Simurians, right? But we know that this man-made disaster that destroyed their planet was of their own doing. It wasn't something that Earthlings caused. It was just the same tensions and feuds that we deal with on Earth, but they dealt with on their planet. And the tragic thing is he already felt that way, right? Before this tragedy. And yet Dura kind of showed him like, hey, no, we have to do this by coming together. And Cross believed him, and he believed in that, but then got completely rejaded by whatever this tragedy that we're about to see unfolds is. So he certainly is like doubled down now, thinking that it's impossible to coexist. But yeah, I think that beautifully explains his reaction in this moment when Tsurugi was, saying like, I thought we were supposed to be neighbors. It's because it reminded him of his mentor, right? Of Dura. And so that's why in this moment, he kind of acted without even thinking to go in there and save Tsurugi. So I'm so interested to see Cross's development across this story of like this jaded guy hopefully giving this coexistence thing another chance, like maybe being willing to try again in the face of the tragedy that he's already seen so much of. And now it's too soon to say anything for sure, but I'm very curious about what specifically led to the destruction of their homeworld, because it seems to be more than just this war between the Lumiere and the Deskunte. And I say that because I think Dabra is a Deskunte because of his horns. In the scene where we saw the big ship sailing down the canal, everyone on the ship had horns. So I imagine they are the Deskunte. So it's interesting that they're still like together as refugees. So like maybe the destruction of their homeworld forced them to come together, even if their war is what destroyed the homeworld, or like what's going on there, right? So they might even be proof that coexistence is possible in the face of tragedy. But if so, he's still pretty jaded. So I just can't wait to find out more about everything that happened with them. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one, y'all. I hope you enjoyed the DBZ cameos here. But be sure to let me know all of your thoughts down below in the comments. And be sure to come back on Sunday where we will get all of the proper names for all of these things and any of the nuance in some of these conversations that might have been lost in these rough translations. But as always, thank you so much for watching.